now I would like to welcome the new panelist from abroad, from the UK. So those of you who need interpreting, please find Czech channel. And I would like to welcome Mrs. Pamela Firth, who is a social worker in palliative care. She is the chairwoman of the European Association for Palliative Care Working Group and also founding member of the Hospice and Palliative Social Work Global Network. As we can see, Mrs. Firth comes from palliative care, and that's why we will hear something about social work and palliative to adapt yourself to new COVID-19 conditions. Pamela Firth, floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's really, really nice to join you today. I have to say I was really hoping to see you in Prague, but this underlines the real value that we can now have all these virtual community meetings. So yes, I am a palliative care social worker, and I also trained as a counsellor, and I've been working in palliative care for a long time. But what I want to share today is the vital work that's been done by the specialists of palliative care social workers, and to give you some insights into what's happened not only in the UK but in other countries too, and to look a bit at the multitude of loss that we're facing and the distress and social problems, and to think about the social work interventions that have been shared, and also to think about some of the lessons that we've learned, particularly around self-care and also what social work can offer. So just looking at these awful figures from January 2021, 100 million people have been infected by COVID and 2.1 million people have died. Now we know that that's much larger. But in England, very sobering to note that 63 of our qualified social workers have died of the virus, and globally, millions of health and social care workers have died. It's had a big impact on social care. So what we're seeing is the rapid spread of the virus and how it's demonstrated how interconnected we all are, and is put under the microscope, particularly the effects of poverty, of health inequalities, and reduced or lack of service provision. We've seen that hugely in the UK, where we've had to intervene in populations around poverty, around food, etc. But I'll talk more about that. We've seen a rise in child and domestic abuse, and we know that coming along are more mental health problems due to isolation. But here in the UK, which is a rich Western country, 10 years of austerity resulting in a population with more underlying health problems, more poverty, and a health service that's been chronically underfunded for years and years. And that has had a major effect on the way that we have dealt with COVID in this country. So I know that Uhatral from the International Federation of Social Workers has already talked to you. And he, I know in a recent post, said that COVID has seen social workers reclaim their value and role. It's also put tremendous focus on our communities. And it's also highlighted, and I heard in the previous speech, the issue of advocacy, a major role for us as social workers to advocate for a much fairer distribution of resources. We've been lobbying in this country governments for a social response, and we've had to advocate for social services to remain open. We've also, all of us in social work, and I assume this is the same in the other countries that are represented here and in the Czech Republic, that we're constantly having to manage ethical dilemmas. Because what we do as social workers, what we know about is cultural, sensitive, and nuanced quality of services. We understand about cultures. So it's really, really important that we stress what are the sorts of things that have helped in this pandemic. So definitely, we have seen in the UK, and I know from colleagues I work with in Europe, there's been a community focus. This awful case, I can say this because I absolutely hate this movement in the UK social work towards case management. I think it was a disaster. And thank goodness we've moved to a more community-focused way of helping communities. So the sorts of things that we saw in the UK, which you probably saw on the news, when the Grenfell Tower disaster happens, over 70 people died in a high-rise flat, a block of flats that caught fire, that the community came together. And it was a very, very mixed community of different religions, different ethnic groups. And they came together to work with each other to support. And many of the services were provided by social workers. So what we're seeing particularly, and I don't think this is just for social workers in palliative care, but we're certainly seeing lots of examples of new systems, of helplines that have been set up, of online family counselling, of homeless shelters, and culturally sensitive practices around a whole range of groups. One of the things that the social workers have been doing in this country over the last 2 or 3 weeks is going out without protection. I say small groups of social workers and nurses have been going into shelters, they've been going onto the streets, they've been going into traveller communities and offering people vaccination. So we need to set up services that meet the new realities. So I just thought it would be useful to share with you what I think the changes are in the UK, and I'm sure it's probably very similar in other countries too. So we've had lockdown measures; they've come and gone, and for us, most of us, the anxiety levels are very high. There's a lot of anger and frustration, particularly at the government. There have been massive issues for social workers around safeguarding, and issues around old age and loneliness, and the breakdown of kinship communities, no visiting for care homes, and then this tremendous fear of carers who are looking after their relatives who fear going out. And I wanted to add to the lack of touch, the inability to be able to hug and love people. On the other side, the reduced services in our community, and I'm sure it's so across the world, that that daycare facilities, the very kind of things that help families, are closing. And day hospices in the UK have been tremendously hit by the pandemic. We've had to reduce services and we've moved to online services. But that is extremely discriminatory. There's a lot of digital poverty around the world, and to assume that everybody can use a computer, has broadband, etc., is just complete rubbish. So there's a real lack of support out there as well. So I just wanted to say a little bit about palliative care social work, which has been going in the UK probably for about 40 years, 30 to 40 years. Dame Cicely Saunders, the founder of the modern hospice services, was actually a social worker, then a nurse, and then a doctor. But it's just emerging in some countries as speciality. But what we found when we did our EAPC survey, that there were tremendous differences in the membership of teams and also in the education. So, what has been the palliative care social work responses? Well, there have been quite a lot of threats. In fact, palliative care has often been seen as medical and nursing. And this has been accentuated during the pandemic, particularly in the UK, maybe, and I think probably in the US as well. There have been enormous problems about fundraising, and some services have closed. Some social workers have lost their jobs in palliative care, and others have been furloughed because they're not seen as vital. There have been lots of our members that have said, and I'm sure this is true across the world, that there wasn't enough PPE, and certainly when it came to rationing the PPE, social workers were not given priority. In some hospices, social workers weren't allowed to visit families and community because of the risk. And I know this caused enormous problems because how do you access people who don't have a computer? You can't go and see them. And they're not always able to talk well on the phone. They may have hearing difficulties. So, having said that, what have we achieved? We've actually achieved quite a lot. There are lots of global examples of helping people to say goodbye. That's been a really big issue, I'm sure, in the Czech Republic, as it has in the UK, in the US, in Ireland, in India, in Africa. How do you say goodbye to people when you're not allowed to visit them? So in this country and other countries, we know where it's possible, and we're talking about a rich country here, that we've used iPads, we've used audio recordings, and social workers in this country have got lots and lots of people to crochet and make little hearts, so that if your relatives goes into hospital with a COVID diagnosis, you give them a heart and you keep one yourself. So there have been lots of really, really powerful attempts to help. We've also done quite a lot of memorialize it, recognizing different cultures. There have been examples of Northern Ireland in sharing basic education in end-of-life care, so that other social workers in the social services department can recognise dying. There have been lots of examples in this country of online courses for social worker. In India, taking education out to small rural villages. That's been hugely important in Africa too, of social workers going out sharing their expertise. In this country, there's been a lot of designing of training for local charities. For instance, I work with a charity called Carers in Hertfordshire, which has 350,000 carers on its books, and many of them are very lonely. They've seen their loved ones die, And there's been a 70% rise in calls to helpline, not just with that charity, but other charities too. So palliative care social workers have been designing courses, have been supporting helplines to deal with the huge numbers of people who are calling in. So I think what has been really, really interesting is the way in which all of us have developed online casework for individuals and families. It's been a real learning curve. How do you, work with a family online? How can you see families? How does it work? So what we've learned, I could talk a lot about what we've learned about using Zoom and telephone counselling. But the one thing that strikes me is you have to have much shorter sessions. If you're using the telephone and I'm listening to somebody, I close my eyes because I can listen better. Zoom is tremendously intrusive for some people. I teach counselling, and I remember one or two students that we had that couldn't find anywhere in the house to undertake their training. One student had a derelict caravan in her garden, and so she herself built a kind of office so that she could go down there and receive her training. But again, digital poverty is detrimental. But there's been advocacy for laptops around the world, but you still have to have broadband and Wi-Fi. So one of our palliative care social workers, who's also quite a famous researcher, he and his colleagues in one of the London teaching hospitals, the one that's had the most palliative care patients, COVID patients, they decided that the thing that they could do as a social work team was to offer to be the point of contact for families. So they made themselves available. They worked out a rota and they attached themselves to the COVID wards. So instead of the doctors and nurses having to ring families to tell families that their loved one was dying, that's what the social workers did. And these are just some of the hearts that I was talking about and some of the soft toys that have been distributed by social workers. This is Sheila Murray's marvellous presentation that she wrote in Social Work Today about her work with palliative care in a large hospice with COVID patients. So let's look at what we're talking about. Marie Curie, one of our most foremost researching institutions, actually presented the results of the bereavement issues in the UK. So you can see that only 85% were unable to say goodbye, just what I've been talking about. 75 people who were bereaved experienced extreme socialization. How can you grieve when you can't talk to people that knew the person who's died? How can you grieve when your family are the other end of the country and you can't visit? And they talked about living in a perpetual state of COVID trauma. And, the researchers in that will be carrying on and giving us more data. So I just wanted to just highlight really what we're talking about and what are the effects of a COVID death. There are going to be huge, huge issues, and there's a commonality between COVID deaths and disaster. We know that carers in particular are very vulnerable. They're very frightened of becoming ill themselves and they're exhausted and powerless. This is what they tell us as palliative care social workers. We know, those of you that have studied bereavement, that these deaths to do with COVID are a disaster. Okay, right. So can I finish off or? Yeah, okay. Right, I'm going to continue with my presentation, but just to the end, because I just want to highlight one or two things. Okay, I'm just going to carry on. Right. So, what helps us as social workers? Team working, a sense of belonging, a strong reflective culture, and education. And I just wanted to flag this up as my last slide, that we formed a World Hospice and Palliative Care Network. And just to let you know that our paper has been published, it was published yesterday in the Social Work in End of Life collaboration, and it was published in the Social Work Journal. So thank you for listening, and do have a look at my presentation, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Paní Firth, mnohokrát vám.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Firth, for your very important contribution. Yesterday, we also talked about dignified death in the era of pandemics, and we're for sure going to refer to your entire article and are going to make your presentation available. So thank you very much. Now, due to the time pressure, we need to have a break, because after the break there is an important part. We're going to have the awards, Gratias 2021. So please come back at 10:45. Thank you.